Started wondering to myself when I'm teaching a class at 11:30 at night. That's what at least it feels like. Okay, what we're going to do tonight is two things. Number one, we're going to talk a little bit more about Herzl, go back a little in time to his early days, mention a couple things I mentioned last week again, and kind of weave it into the story. And then after that, we're going to enter a topic that will take us probably 3 weeks or three classes, maybe more. It basically is the history of Zionism. We'll start off with an interesting perspective, I hope, when we get to it in a little bit. Okay, so as I mentioned, we talked about Herzl last week and his presence at the Dreyfus Affair, but now let's go back a little bit in time and meet who he really was. He's born in 1860 in Pest, that becomes Budapest, capital of Hungary. He came from a very prosperous, cultured, 100% thoroughly assimilated family. His parents, they were proud to be Jewish, but not in the traditional sense as far as practice. They were just Jews. They were proud of being Jewish. And Herzl himself was educated, German culture, Goethe, Schiller, all the different heavy thinkers, much more than Hebrew texts, much more than Jewish tradition, because that took a back seat. Now, jump ahead for a moment to even modern times, but let me just go back to, let's say, the 1980s. I had the opportunity for more than a few years to teach in a Hebrew high school afternoon program for kids that were learning towards their bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. I wasn't teaching them for bar mitzvah, but it's just Jewish thought and all. And their parents sent them to regular, quote unquote, public school. And then in the afternoon, a couple of days a week, they had this. Their knowledge in most cases was far more than a person who would have been like Herzl. And yet they also, the vast 98% of their learning and their experience and everything was the secular stuff. And then 2% was the Jewish stuff. And some of them, unfortunately, abandoning it right after the bar mitzvah, and others maintaining and sometimes growing. So it's not, what they say, he was sipur shechozer atzmo. It's a story that repeats itself. He grew up the product of the idea, something known in German as Bildung or Bildung, that Jews can be accepted as equals as long as they excelled as in European culture, literature, law, art. In other words, if you're completely assimilated, then the theory was that your Judaism takes a back seat. Parentheses, it never takes a back seat. Nowhere on earth. Never have, never has, and never will. He studied law in Vienna, but at the same time is more drawn towards literature. His goal was to become a playwright, which, as we talked about last week, and I'll mention again tonight, he ends up changing the world, the Jewish world, because of this. He originally wrote comedies and dramas. I know no one here tonight on Blind knows that in high school I actually wrote plays. Trust me, they didn't make it to Broadway. He worked as a commentator and he wrote essays for the Neue Free Press, which eventually appointed him to Paris as a correspondent in 1891, which is critical because the Dreyfus Affair, which I'm going to mention again very briefly, because we spent most of the class last week talking about it. But Herzl had a crisis of an identity crisis because he had these competing ideas in his head. On the one hand, when it came to anti-Semitism, and again, part of this I mentioned last week, so I'm sorry for the repetition, but it's important to get back to move it and weave it into tonight. On the one hand, he felt that one of the solutions to anti-Semitism was this, he called the solution through baptism, literally mass conversion of Jews. Remember, if you don't have a connection to your Jewish heritage and you don't have any practice, so evidently it doesn't seem to be such a big deal to throw it all away, take on the cloak of Christianity and move along with life, and that's it. That was on the one hand. First of all, it also showed how little attachment he had to his Judaism, which, when you think about it, knowing who he became to us, is kind of crazy. But the Dreyfus Affair, again, if you missed the class last week, go back and watch the video or do a little reading online, taught him that conversion for sure would not solve the problem. The hatred wasn't only religious, it was national, it was social, it was structural, meaning it was systemic from the word system. It went through the entire system, just whatever it was. There was someone who posted, I didn't really read it because enough junk that I see online. Someone posted today on Facebook, a news, one of these self-made news agencies. It said that the list of the top 10 richest people in the world, and 7 of them are Jews. And the whole point was like, yeah, basically, see, the Jews have all the money. Like, yeah. And then someone commented, yeah, but like how many percentages of the Nobel Prize winners are Jews? And let's see the list of all the Arab winners and all the Palestinian winners, Palestinians. In his diaries, he wrote very passionately about this being torn between, he doesn't really have a connection to his Jewish heritage, but he knows that that's really what's causing problems. He understands that maybe they should maybe secede from Judaism, but seeing that is not going to be the answer because of the Dreyfus affair. He doesn't know where he's going with this at this point, and a whole new idea takes hold. I'm going to read you a sentence and translate it into English from his diary. If Jews were persecuted not as individuals, but as a people, then the only solution was national, not individual. They must cease to think of themselves as a scattered religious minority, and instead act as a political nation with territory, sovereignty, and international recognition. Basically saying that it's not like you have a problem and the guy down the street might have a problem, but I don't have a problem. It's the Jews. The Jews have the problem. The goal, which he is putting here, is at this point in time of history, is absolutely a pipe dream. Talking about your own land, sovereignty over your own land. Not only that, but it's not that you're just a renegade and trying to, pop a sign and say that there's such a country, as what I'm calling it Israel. He didn't call it at that point. And international recognition. So it's a pipe dream. In 1896, he publishes the Manifesto der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state. It was a slim volume, maybe not even 80 pages. Oh, speaking of that, kind of a 1 second digression of a commercial. Tomorrow night, for those of you who are at Ma'ale Adumim, and even if you're outside, you want to come in, I'm having a book launch in Pnei Shmuel, in the new social hall. It's downstairs in what used to be the Gan, of my 3rd volume, Piyutim. This volume is in memory of Yakir Teitelbaum, Hashem Yikum Damo, and love to see anybody who can make it there. End parentheses. My book is not going to be have the same impact as Der Judenstaat, trust me. It was slim, but it changed history. I mean, it sounds like a very bold statement to make, but it is absolutely true. This 80-page volume absolutely changed history. It was written like a political pamphlet. It was a call to action, and he had in there certain key arguments. Now, the metamorphosis of and change of Herzl's approach to what the Jews needed really went from one extreme to another. From basically, let's just drop Judaism, to Judaism needs a national homeland. So number one was anti-Semitism is not able to be eradicated. It's not going to happen. It may go up and down. It may get better for the Jews. It may get worse for the Jews. He's living in a time of the Enlightenment has been going on. And before that, they had the Emancipation. And before that, the things were okay. Then before that, they were terrible. And before that, they were good. But there's like ups and downs, but it doesn't ever go away. And he said that the Jew will always be seen as an alien. Number two, assimilation is a failed dream. He himself said no matter how much the Jews tried to integrate, they will not be accepted as equals. He saw that with his own eyes, not just as a result of the Dreyfus affair, but as he started to use that as kind of his wake-up call to see it around him. The Jews are, number three, the Jews are a nation. They're not just a religious group, but it's a group bound by history, destiny, a collective identity. We're going to talk about language maybe tonight. I purposely did not mention it because he doesn't mention it. We're going to talk about Hebrew if we get to it tonight. Otherwise, Bezrat Hashem next week. And because that you can't get rid of anti-Semitism, because of all the things he said till now, there's only one solution. And he felt that solution was sovereignty. Now, keep in mind when he says sovereignty and he wants a homeland, he wants secured international borders, he wants international recognition, he wants to live in safety and in dignity. He's not talking about Israel necessarily. He's not necessarily talking about Israel. But in order to have something, he has to also realizes there has to be a political organization. He envisions something that he refers to in English as the Society of Jews. And their purpose would be to handle settlement of a land, finance. If I walk down to the park at the bottom of the hill where we live, and I post a sign that says, "Welcome to Shandalovia," and I'm its king, besides them probably calling mental health professionals, rightfully so, it doesn't mean anything, right? Just because you call yourself Palestine and you mentioned that in 1964 you decided to try and kill people because you want a country which never existed and never will exist, doesn't make it a fact. So he could not just say, "Oh, well, it's just half on it." There had to be a plan. He was very much about a planning of what was going to happen step by step. As far as, again, the location, what was at that time known as Palestine, Jewish and Arab, he naturally leaned toward it for historical reasons, for symbolic reasons, but he left open possibility of other territory, including Argentina. Now, some of you would say, wait, not Argentina, you mean Uganda. Uganda comes up as an alternative in one of the World Zionist Congresses. Not yet. This is still pre the World Zionist Congress, which isn't until a couple years later in 1897, which I mentioned about a little last week. Even Argentina. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the countries right now in Europe and in South America, who are, especially in South America, who are standing with Israel and standing against Israel, Argentina is one of the only ones that's fully with Israel, which is kind of interesting that this is one of Herzl's, one of his possible locations. So, by the way, if we were in South America instead of Israel, God forbid, we'd be heading in towards summer now instead of winter in Israel. In any case, his openness to doesn't have to be Palestine/Israel caused some controversy. Makes sense that it would cause controversy, but it showed that Herzl was very pragmatic. The idea was sovereignty, not sentiment. In other words, yes, we have a direct connection to the land of Israel. Yes, we have a historical connection. Yes, we have our souls may be connected. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. But tachlis, if you want to have a chance at something, we have to have a place where we're going to be able to have sovereignty. We're able to have our own land, etc. And to put your nice, sweet sentiment aside. And he convenes in 1897 the first Zionist Congress, which they had the World Zionist Congress was just here last week in Israel. And it was representatives from most of Europe. It was held in Basel, Switzerland. 200 delegates attended, including 26 women who were delegates, yet they did not have voting rights. Now you say, "Oh my God, they didn't have voting rights." Yeah, well, think about the time you were talking about. In the United States, the women still didn't have. The suffragette movement was, I don't even know, was in its infancy yet. You think about how backward it was, and the blacks and segregation and civil rights and whatever. In any case, it was the Congress. Herzl didn't want to just have, okay, we're going to all meet in Binyaneh Umar. We're going to have some like Keter chairs. We're going to sit there. He wanted it to be a show. He insisted on formal dress, music from orchestras, decorum, for one main reason, and that is to project dignity and seriousness. I have used this example that I'm about to tell you many times over the years in different ways. It's not my original example. I've heard it from other people. If you are going to have, let's assume you're not a vegetarian and you like meat and you like steak, and someone's going to prepare a nice steak dinner for you with a glass of wine. And they take the steak off the grill and you hear the sizzle and your mouth is watering, and then they take it and put it on a paper plate and give you a plastic knife and a plastic fork, and the wine is in a plastic cup or in a paper cup. It is the exact same meat, it is the exact same wine. What just happened to your sensory approach to that meal? Paper plate, a plastic cup for wine? Really? Where's my crystal goblet? Where's the china? Where's the nice, at least Corel, something? So he understood packaging. He understood the mechanics of making it look something formal, and he didn't want people showing up in jeans and whatever jeans, but jeans and t-shirts, so to speak. He established the idea in Basel of calling for a legal, secure homeland in the land of Palestine. And the words he used, I'm quoting this in English now. Of course, he didn't say it in English. It was what he called the Basel Program to establish for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine. And he used those words very judiciously. Publicly recognized meant international legitimacy. Fast forward for a second to May 1948, within less than 1 hour after we declared independence from England and Israel was now our country, May of 48, Tafshin Chet. Within less than an hour, President of the United States recognizes the land of Israel as Israel. Legally secured meant that there were binding guarantees. Again, you could go to other countries. You needed money to grow a country. So let's assume for a moment, which he does become an ambassador, in quotes, an ambassador goes around collecting funds and getting guarantees. Those guarantees had to be good, because if you start to build a community or a kibbutz or a building because you're expecting, $10 million to be coming in, and then nothing comes in, that's a problem. And a homeland was flexible enough to allow negotiation. He just said homeland. What does that mean? It's kind of a bit of a open-ended word. But again, as I mentioned last week, he did say very famously that in 1947, when he convened the first Congress, First World Jewish Congress, Zionist Congress, that he said that he says, today, basically, I have founded the Jewish state. And if they don't say it in 5 years or 10 years, they will certainly say it in 50. And almost 50 years later, actually 50 years later, almost to the day, was the UN vote of the partition of Palestine. And because we all know how wonderful the United Nations is, that's a very important part of our history. Side point, if you go into the neighborhood where streets are funny names like Guatemala and others in Yerushalayim, those are all those who voted for partition. It's near Hadassah and Karim, near the Mifletzet. So if you ever wondered why they had those names of those streets there, that's why. Anyways, so after this is a couple years later, and this whole idea started to grow. Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, the First World Zionist Congress, the idea of the Basel program starting to branch out with this information. In 1902, he publishes his Alt Neuland novel, which was basically a future Jewish Commonwealth. It was looking towards the future of a modern society of Jewish people, technologically advanced, tolerant, just. And his motto, I'll read it to you in German, Wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen. If you will it is no dream, which we know, of course, is Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you really want it, it's not just a pipe dream, it's no dream. You can make it happen. He obviously made this statement very famous. Now, as a small digression, there is a direct connection between the name of this book and a city is Israel founded in 1909, the city of Tel Aviv. For those of you who are familiar with that, you can sleep for 10 seconds, but I'll give you the background. The word Alte Neuland, which meant old new land, is the basis of the name Tel Aviv. Tel, Taf Lamed, is an ancient, I'm just going to say, it's not a mound, but like an ancient location that's been excavated, over years has covered up. Tel Lachish and there's all over Israel, see Tel. So it's something old. Aviv is spring, something new, refreshing, a new start, a new beginning. So the name Tel Aviv is a direct offshoot of Alte Neuland, or the old new land. And that's where Tel Aviv got its name. Herzl worked on diplomacy. What was amazing with him, he died very young, we'll see in a few minutes, was that he didn't rest. He didn't delegate as far as the important things. He took it upon himself to become an ambassador for a country that was yet to exist. He took it upon himself to travel as much as he could to try to get sponsors and money for this nascent country. He met with Kaiser Wilhelm II in Constantinople and in Yerushalayim because he wanted German help. He met with the Ottoman Sultan also to get the empire to finance a return of Jews to the land of Palestine. He spoke with the British individuals, which eventually led to this Uganda proposal. I mentioned earlier that at one point it was happened to be in 1903, the idea was floated at the Congress, at the Zionist Congress, that instead of Palestine/Israel, that we would settle in Uganda. Of course, but the condition was it was temporary. It was temporary, that a refuge until we could actually secure funding and actually have the land of Israel. Until then, it would be something temporary, and it nearly split the movement. The Jews in Eastern Europe, they rejected it outright. Those more from Western Europe would consider it more. And again, it makes sense because it was Eastern Europe that was having more problems between the pogroms and other things that were happening in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, before this is coming under consideration. He remained a man under tremendous personal pressure, some of it self-imposed, some of it from outside. He aged very rapidly. He traveled a tremendous amount. It took a terrible toll on his health, doing all negotiations, doing his travel, resistance within his own Jewish world and from out. And in July 1904, at only 44 years old, he died in Vienna. He was reinterred in Israel in 1949. Hopefully, I couldn't get him today, but I will have someone speak to us for a few minutes, someone from our neighborhood whose father was instrumental in bringing Herzl's body in 1949 to Israel. And there's a plaque now, as of a few years ago, at Har Herzl in honor of this man who helped bring his body. We'll leave you in a little bit of suspense until I can have him speak to our class. Herzl did not, when it go back just a little bit, did not set out to save Dreyfus. That wasn't his goal. As a matter of fact, it was what came out of the Dreyfus affair that brought him through this whole series of events that led to this moment of the founding of the World Zionist Congress and everything else. It wasn't about Dreyfus, the man. It was about what it symbolized. And what it symbolized was the fragility of emancipation. That, yes, the Jews were emancipated just like the rest of France and like the rest of so much more of Europe. But for the Jew, he was still secondary. And it limited the integration into society. Herzl transformed this whole lesson that he learned by being present at the Dreyfus trial and the aftermath into a political doctrine. There are many people, I shouldn't say that, it's not true. There are some people who see problems and they try to solve them. I'm not talking about the door is jammed, let's spray it with some WD-40. Okay, that's nice. I'm talking about on a global scale. Some things are invented by accident, they're discovered by accident, some things are invented on purpose. But Herzl, basically gave birth to where many of us are sitting right now in the land of Israel. Not the historical, not talking about the religious part of it, talking the fact that we have a country, Medinat Yisrael, we can put into the hands of Theodor Herzl. He didn't do very well in his family as far as Judaism, by the way. His kids converted, become Christians, and it's fine. I'm not going to talk about that because that's not relevant to our discussion. But like I say, he is considered the founder of pretty much modern Zionism. So I'm going to talk starting now about something I'll call the history of Zionism. There are books this thick about Zionism, history of Zionism. Obviously, I can't do it justice over even a few classes, and it'd be boring after a while, unless you're really into it. The history of Zionism. So what we're going to do is talk about some of the history going back to the mid-1800s, bringing it up to about 1948. Obviously, we're going to have to go back and pick up a whole bunch of other stuff, but right now, over the next few weeks, talking about the history of Zionism. But before we do that, and we're going to talk about certain big personalities, some names you may know. For those of you who have been in Yerushalayim, you passed what they call the Pinsker building. Who is Pinsker? Okay, he's a mover and a shaker early on, which we'll talk about. Some of you may come from communities where the name of your show was Chovavei Zion. Was that just, or maybe you belong to some organization that there was a chapter called Bilu. All these names have a history and a background to them that tie directly to the early days of Zionism. But before we do that, I want to do two things. Number one is to do something we did in our Tefillah class last year about this word, Zion or Zion. Zionism is the English of Zionut, Shoresh Zion, right? The word Zion is used multiple ways in Hebrew. You take a test, you get a tziyun or a grade. You have a marking on a grave. It's called a tziyun for the grave. Yerushalayim is called Zion. So what do they have in common? The word Zion really means a marker or a location. Like it's almost like you can point to something. As if when you have a tziyun on a grave, you're saying this is where the grave is. When a person, takes a test, his tziyun, his score, his grade, you can see where the student is in their knowledge. Again, it's not always a good example or a measure of how the student is. They just may not be good at tests or just good at guessing. And Zion is a marker. It's like, this is it. This is the place in the world where Hashem has chosen this to be for his children, you and me, for us to be living and serving Hashem. That's where Zion comes from. That's a nice thing. Now I'm going to read you something that's not so nice. Okay. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look it up yourselves. I'm going to take about a minute and a half to read something to you. That's from Wikipedia. If you go on Wikipedia and you type in, you go into Zionism, type Zionism and look at the Wikipedia article, I'm going to read you a few paragraphs. And there's a reason I'm reading it. In pursuing a Jewish demographic majority, the Zionist movement encountered the demographic problem posed by the presence of the local Arab population, which was predominantly non-Jewish. The practical issue of establishing a Jewish state in a majority non-Jewish region was an issue of fundamental importance for the Zionist movement. In other words, when the Zionists want to move to Israel, they had a big problem. There are all these goyim here, all these Arabs. Now what are they going to do? Many Zionist activists intended to establish a Jewish majority through Jewish immigration to the region. Zionists used the term transfer as a euphemism for the removal, or what we would now call ethnic cleansing, of the Palestinian population. According to Benny Morris, the idea of transfer played a large role in Zionist ideology from the inception of the movement and was seen as the main method of maintaining the Jewishness of the Zionist state, a bold-faced lie. He argues that, quote, transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism, and the land that was primarily Arab could not be transformed into a Jewish state without displacing the Arab population. Further, the stability of the Jewish state could not be ensured given the Arab population's fear of displacement. He argues that this would be the primary source of conflict between the Zionist movement and the Arab population. Last paragraph. The concept of transfer had a long pedigree in Zionist thought, as it was considered both moral and practical as a way to deal with the Palestinian, quote, problem, create a Jewish homeland, and avoid ethnic conflict. The concept of removing the non-Jewish population from Palestine garnered support across the entire spectrum of Zionist groups, again, another lie, eventually including its farthest left factions who, after realizing the extent of the destruction of European Jewry, viewed it as a lesser evil. Transfer thought began early in the movement's development in various forms. No, it didn't. Transfer was not only seen as desirable, but also as an ideal solution by some of the Zionist leadership, but it remained controversial. Tachlis, with the article in Wikipedia, which is the source of information for millions and millions of people who just want to learn about something, is that Zionism is about racial and ethnic cleansing of the land of Israel to get rid of its Arab population. That's on Wikipedia. Pretty sad. Okay. Why am I mentioning that? Because what we see today, the hatred, and not to mention Resolution 33, I think 9497, equating racism with Zionism with racism, which for them was repealed in the 1990s. For those of us who remember both votes, the United Nations, we've always been going uphill. It's not just in the 1800s. Even now, we know it. We see it every single day. All you do is look at the news. But now we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to talk about the evolution of Zionism from the pre-modern days, let's go into like the 1800s, to the establishment of the state of Israel. Because we're Jews, and I don't mean this as a joke. I mean, it's serious. And it'd be true with most people, I would imagine, groups of people. We had different approaches, different ideologies, different religiosity, different social forces that came upon all of us and them to decide how to do it. In other words, there's this great idea, Zionism. We need a homeland. This is even before Herzl. There has to be something. How are we going to do it? So from the early nationalist thoughts of a man named Zvi Kalischer and a man named Alkali, all the way to the secular activists like Pinsker and Herzl, you have different, and the revisionist variations, the religious variations, the labor variations, the culture. We need to make Aliyah. We need to have a country for cultural reasons. We need to have for labor reasons, for religious reasons. We have revisionist Zionism, all kinds of isms when it came to an approaches to Zionism. We're going to look at a few key figures: Achad Ha'am, Ben Yehuda, Katzenelison, Ben Gurion, Jabotinsky, Rav Kook, and some others. I'm not going to go through them all tonight, obviously. I'm going to get a little bit. But we have to talk about a lot of interesting information about these people. We're going to do something similar to what we did when we were talking about European history and the Jews. We will take a look at some general information, look at some individual biographies, nothing very long, and see how their approaches were similar and some radically different, and how it played in the street. Zionism was never a monolithic ideology. What that means in normal English is it wasn't like this is Zionism. It's not. There's no such thing, because there are different perspectives. And that's what we're going to talk about. From the time of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. Now, for those of you who remember, when we started this class, I think it's a couple of years ago almost, February, I think it'll be 2 years. We started with a man named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I told you he was one of my heroes in Jewish history because he's, as far as I'm concerned, he saved Judaism. One of a few people along the timeline of Jewish history that he gave hope to the Jewish people after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash. From the time of the second Beit HaMikdash destruction in the years, approximately year 70 of the Common Era, until 1948, we had absolutely no sovereignty in this country. We were ruled, for better or worse, by many, many different countries and authorities. And all the tour guides in this group that are in this class can give much better background to all that, which I'm not going to go into. But we didn't have, it wasn't our country. And for the most part, for a couple thousand years, it was a pipe dream. For those of you who recall learning the Kuzari, which we did a few years ago, there was a discussion between the king. If you don't know the background to the book, it's okay. Just take my word for it right now. A non-Jewish king, is talking to a rabbi about Judaism and trying to learn about Judaism. That's kind of the general idea. So in the second essay, in chapter 25, I've said it so many times, I just remember it by heart. As in chapter 20, in section 25, the king turns to this rabbi and says, I'm confused. You're telling me, because they were talking about prayer at the time, I'm very confused. You're telling me that all your prayers are about Israel, and you mentioned Zion, and return to Zion, and living in Israel and everything. And what are you doing here? Why are you not living in your country? Why are you not living there? And he responds with two words. Hovashtani hamelech. My king, you have embarrassed me. You are correct. And he goes on and say how correct he is. And he ends the paragraph by saying that all the Jews' prayers are nothing but tziftzuf hazarzir, which means the twittering of birds. What does that mean? That for thousands of years, Jews would be mouthing the words in their prayer about, oh, we want to see, go back to Israel, let our eyes see the return of God to Zion, let the Beit HaMikdash be rebuilt, and not just the Beit HaMikdash, but we say the Devir, which is the first Beit HaMikdash, the same amazing building that we had back then. How many people really believe what they're saying? How many believe really what they're aspiring to? And so for thousands of years, and even by the way, today, and so for thousands of years, you have people who maybe did or didn't believe it could happen one day. But when you're talking about being under the rule of other people, and then you're talking about, forget about being in Israel, talking about being in Europe and Russia and the pogroms and the murder of Jews and everything else, the idea of having your own homeland, it was a distant nothing. There was no chance you could dream about it. That was about it. So for like 2,000 years, we're dispersed in communities all over the world. A land of Israel, which basically barely was inhabited, but it had Jews, but it was barely inhabited. Even in the 1800s, when what's his name, Mark Twain came and described it basically as a desolate wasteland. Look what we've turned it into, Baruch Hashem. In rabbinic literature, in our tefillot, in the Haggadah, at the end of Yom Kippur, we say L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim HaBenuya. We want to be in next year, in the rebuilt Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, the land of Israel, is always seen as a place of divine presence, promise of God for the Jewish people, the idea of a Messiah. But it was more of a political slogan almost than it really was a formula of faith. Yes, of course, there were people over the centuries who did believe and felt we would have a return to Zion, etc. But for the most part, until the early 1800s, again, it was a pipe dream. We talked about these early messianic movements. We talked about the Shabtai Tzvi many months ago. We did talk lahavdil, shouldn't put them in the same sentence, that the disciples of the Vilna Gaon who did come to the land of Israel, but their goal was more theological than national. They weren't necessarily looking for a homeland for the Jewish people and Zionism. They were wanted to be where they're talking about their tefillah. They wanted to establish a place here in this country. The decisive change, of course, comes with the Enlightenment, with political emancipation of Jews in Western Europe, the Haskalah, which we've talked about extensively, the Jewish Enlightenment, which again encouraged secular education, linguistic integration, the arts, culture, exposed Jews both to the good things, this concept of emancipation and freedom, and what was then modern anti-Semitism was modern because they were alive during it. The coming together of the Enlightenment and nationalism, again, nationalism is being patriotic, you having your own homeland. It started to give birth to a new vocabulary for the Jews: nationhood, homeland, sovereignty. And these ideas start now to come up in people's minds. You have, on the one hand, things are doing great for the Jews. They're integrating, they're assimilating. And then we talked about this a couple of weeks back, that things were going up, and then all of a sudden they start to turn down. And as they're starting to turn, before they start going up, and as they start to turn down, these two bookends, there are people starting already to think something's not right. We need to do something. They start to ask themselves, when's our turn? When's our turn? We're people. What was called proto-Zionism, not yet a movement, but it's a proposal, an idea, a thought that's germinating of a nation of sovereignty that has its own sovereignty, self-determination, renewal, and rebirth. I'm going to stop here because instead of starting to talk about Leo Pinsker at this moment, Yehuda Leib Pinsker, known as Leo Pinsker, who becomes one of the early, what they call proto-Zionists. Pick it up next week, Bezrat Hashem. And something I was just going to say, it just went out of my head. Anyways, I'll just wish you a good evening. And for those of you, like I say, those of you who can be there tomorrow night, love to see you. If you're interested in the book, you can, and can't be there, just let me know, of course. And in the meantime, I wish everyone a great week ahead.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.